Okay folks, here is our last video. We are going to cover gradients, which is another CSS3 property. Remember what we said about CSS3 properties? They do not work properly in IE 7 and 8. You need to have a workaround. And we are also going to look at shorthand. Shorthand is kind of backpedaling a little bit. All of the shorthand properties you have available are perfectly legitimate to use in IE 7 and 8. So we'll talk a little bit about those. Gradients. If you look in the book, it'll talk excuse me, a little bit about what your options are. There are two types of gradients that are pretty well supported by modern browsers, and there are rumors of a third type. You've got your linear gradient, which is like the gradient that we used with the graphic, basically a gradient that goes from top to bottom or left to right. You also have the option of what's called a radial gradient, and that basically means you have a gradient that starts off one color in the center and then it radiates outwards like a circle. Today we are largely going to take a look at using ColorZilla, the tool, but we're going to talk a little bit about some of the terminology you're going to encounter when you're dealing with using gradients. One bit of terminology is what's called a color stop, and basically a color stop is where one color in the gradient becomes another. If you look at a gradient, you can sort of see, and I mean, let's just take a look at this background image we've got here. It starts off as this blue color and it sort of fades to a lighter one, and then it ends up fading into white. So you've got 2 to 3 color stops. You could just choose to create a gradient where you plug in the first color, plug in the last color, and let everything sort of in between fall where it may, or you could get really fancy and plug in that middle color too, and that's what we're going to do. So the tool that I tend to use to generate gradients is ColorZilla. If you go to ColorZilla, you go to the Ultimate CSS Gradient Generator, and it will bring you to this page. And I've already plugged everything in, but let me kind of show you how it works. You start off by just sort of choosing a gradient that looks like it's pretty close to what you're trying to accomplish. So I'm going to just choose this sort of really nice subtle gradient that we've got here. And you can see it's got a name. And it's got 3 stops, just like ours. So these little top tabs have to do with the opacity of those colors. So for instance, if you wanted to have a gradient that started off as a solid color and faded off into total transparency, you might click on the opacity stop and change it from 100% opacity to 50% to 0%. We want to keep the opacity exactly where it is. What we are interested in is changing the colors. So let's kind of take a look over here. As you can see, we've got our preview. Our orientation is vertical. That is the direction we want our gradient to be. Your choices are horizontal, vertical, diagonal, heading down to the right and up and to the right, and radial. So we're just going to stick with kind of a vertical top to bottom. If you put a check mark here in IE, code will be generated that will allow your gradient to work properly in older versions of IE as well. Basically, it'll generate the graphic that's needed in order for it to work. We're not interested in that right now, but just be aware that that's an option. Okay, so these bottom little doodads down here are your actual color stops. So when I click on this first one, it gives me the option of specifying what percentage of the way across the gradient I want this color to change, or how far along I want it to go, and where I want it to start. So I want it to start at 0%. This needs to be the very first color, and this is the color we're looking at. So we're going to go back to Photoshop, and I'm going to take a look at this gradient. Now I've already done the eyedropper tool and taken the colors, and with Photoshop, once you've taken your colors, you can just click on the color over here on your toolbar. This will usually be on the left hand side of your screen, by the way, and I've got a hexadecimal value right here that I can just copy and bring it back over, click on this, and paste. Excellent. Now what I also did is we've got a 40% color stop here. I'm going to change it to 50%, and I'm going to change the color. You might have to double click. We're going to come here. Now that's what this other color is. I've got the 50% color. And we're getting pretty close to white, but it's still at least sort of a very, very light gray with a little bit of a tint to it. So that kind of works really nicely. I'm going to come in here and paste that value. And then finally, the last color stop. We know what color this is. This is just white. So we're just going to type And so now we've got our gradient. Excellent. And you can see here that it's vertical. It's pretty much what we're looking for. And so what you do is you come here into the CSS that is generated on the fly. So we don't want to do that. All right, and then we click on copy. Down here in the lower right, you'll see it says copy to clipboard. At which point we're going to come back here. And I'm going to get rid of all of this. All right. So as you can see, ColorZilla generated all of the code for us. We didn't have to worry about vendor prefixes or any of the special things you have to do for different browsers. It gave us a solid color for our older browsers. It gave us the Mozilla vendor prefix for a linear gradient. Let us know which versions of Firefox it works with, and so on. So it generated everything we needed in order to have this work properly. I can tell you that this last statement will not validate. That's okay. I know it won't validate, and so when I go to check your assignments and you've used this and it doesn't validate, I can look and say, oh, I know why that is. The filter property is something that will not validate, but it works just fine. It's a workaround for IE 6 through 9. So we're going to just click on save. Let's take a look at what that does for our background. We can close this out because we're not doing that anymore. And let's refresh this page. And now what we can see is we've got a very nice smooth gradient that starts at the top of the page and runs through to the bottom. Because the other thing that this is going to do is it's going to extend the gradient because the color stops are at percentage points. It's going to look at how tall the element is, and it's going to apply those color stops to those percentage points regardless of the height of the element. So think about that. I mean, that's really, really kind of cool. All right, so that is how you use gradients. You can get into hand coding gradients. Take a look at the ColorZilla generated code. I mean, ultimately, you just list what kind of gradient you want, be it linear or radial, and you have to assign angles and percentages and colors and such. So it's a fairly straightforward process, but ColorZilla is just so much easier because it generates everything you need for every browser combination as well as some fallbacks. So that's really cool. The last thing we want to look at are shorthands. I mean, as we've noticed throughout the process of working, there are lots of different shorthands, and we can kind of see the shorthand here in that the property is just listed as background. Just so you know, linear gradients are typically treated as if they're background images. So if you had a gradient that was listed on an element and you wanted to overwrite that later on in code, you would want to target background image specifically. Okay, so let's come down here to the footer, and we've got all of these different background properties. So let's take a look at how we can shorthand them. The shorthand for backgrounds starts off with the property of background, and you choose the background image you want first. That's the first value that you would have. Then you have a space. The next value would be background position. The next value would be background repeat. The next value would be background attachment, which we don't have, and background color, which we also don't have. So we've got all of these values. Make certain that you only get rid of those items that were addressed. You'll notice that the CSS3 is typically not addressed in the background shortcut. Hopefully with some later incarnation of CSS, it will be. It'll become part of the specification, but as of right now it isn't. And as you can see, we had a couple of little funky things happen as a result of that, and we can go in and sort of tweak that a little bit. Oh, well, I can tell you what part of it is, and we're just going to need to move this, because one of the things that happens when you use background as the property is it actually ends up overwriting previous background properties. That is to say, we're not declaring certain parts of the background property here, and so automatically things are assumed to be according to whatever the defaults are. And when that happens, that can kind of break your layout. So be aware that that's something that can happen, and you can see that kind of scooted that up again. And this did have a background color, that's right, the footer did. So let's go back. And remember that we put that in here, so that would be... And the reason is because, once again, you've got the background, so it overwrote this, and that's where our color went. So now that we've added it back in there, you can see now that the color extends into the footer again. So be aware of that when you're using the background shortcut. All right, let's go see if we've got at least one other one that we can kind of play with a little bit. We might not. Let's see. Actually, we do. We've got the PDF and the Word ones. So I'm just going to do the PDF. So once again, remember, we've got our URL. We've got our position, and we've got our repeat. That allows us to get rid of all of this. And just as we would expect, nothing changed. Okay, let's just go ahead and do Word as well. Once again, no change whatsoever. So, you know, just like you've been doing your font shortcuts and some of your other shortcuts, you've got your background shortcut. And just like those shortcuts, remember that the order in which you declare everything is going to make a difference. So be certain that you're being careful. If things start breaking, when you go from having separate property value pairs or declarations, when they start breaking, when you try to do shorthand, take a look at the order in which you're declaring things. Once again, the order is background image, background position, background repeat, background attachment, background color. Remember that if you declare any of those other values elsewhere, you're going to have to probably declare them again if you're using the shorthand, because what will happen is the browser will automatically look to overwrite it. I think that's really the biggest thing as far as shorthand is concerned. There's also some information about this in the book. Be certain that you really understand it. The next assignment is going to require that you use background images. That is it. Just so you guys are aware, there's going to be another project assigned next week when we meet again. This is starting to become a pattern, unfortunately. And I'm also going to have an extra credit assignment available to you that's going to be directly tied into this information and kind of some of the stuff we're going to cover next week, which is a little bit of an extension of that information. So we'll talk about that. And that's it. Hope you stay safe and warm and dry, and see all of you next Wednesday. Thanks. Have a good night.